In 1987, $800,000 vanished from a shattered armored truck on a rain-soaked Cleveland highway, leaving 3 guards hospitalized and a city questioning how such violence could happen in broad daylight. Decades of dead ends crumbled when a construction crew renovating an abandoned auto shop discovered a single spent shell casing wedged beneath rotting floorboards, its unique firing pin marks matching no weapon in any database. The brass cartridge bore microscopic tool marks that would expose not just the gunman, but a betrayal so intimate it had been hiding within the very institution sworn to protect the money. Rain fell in sheets across Interstate 77, blurring the world outside the Brinks truck into a gray smear of motion and light. Inside, guard Michael Shaw watched the water bead on the reinforced glass, his thoughts on a warm dinner and the end of his shift. A sudden violent impact threw him from his seat, the shriek of tortured metal overwhelming the rhythmic slap of the wipers on the windshield. The truck slewed sideways across the highway lanes, its tires screaming before it slammed to a halt against a concrete divider, the cabin filling with the coppery scent of blood. Masked figures shattered the driver's side window with a sledgehammer, dragging his 2 colleagues out onto the slick pavement. Through the chaos, Michael saw the glint of a pistol, heard the wet thud of a weapon striking flesh, and then the world went dark. When he woke, his head screaming in protest, the rear doors of the truck were ripped open, and the $800,000 in canvas bags were gone, leaving only an echoing emptiness and the distant wail of approaching sirens. 38 years later, Tommy Chen felt the worn wood of his crowbar vibrate in his hands as he pried another rotting floorboard free in the guts of a condemned Cleveland auto shop. The air, thick with the ghosts of oil and rust, did little to mask the smell of decay that clung to the damp joists. His tool struck something hard that wasn't splintering wood or crumbling foundation, producing a sharp metallic chime against the grimy concrete slab below. He knelt, sweeping away decades of dirt and debris with his glove, revealing the small object. It was a single, tarnished brass casing, its open end packed with dust. He almost tossed it aside with the rest of the junk, a stray piece of hardware from some long-forgotten repair, but a flicker of instinct made him pause, his fingers closing around its cool weight. Detective Ray Kowalski crouched in the same spot hours later, the space now illuminated by the sterile sweep of crime scene lighting that carved sharp shadows from the dilapidated garage. He ignored the low murmur of the forensic team and the intermittent flash of their cameras, his entire focus drawn to the 9mm casing resting in a sterile plastic baggie on his palm. It was an insignificant piece of brass to anyone else, but to him it was a voice from the grave, a potential key to a lock that had rusted shut nearly 4 decades ago. His pulse quickened, a familiar thrum of obsessive energy that always signaled the true beginning of a hunt. He'd studied thousands of casings in his 20 years, memorizing the unique language of striations and dents that every firearm imparted on ejected brass. But these marks were different, alien. The indentation left by the firing pin on the primer was oddly shaped, deeper on one side, with a faint but unmistakable scratch arcing away from the center. It wasn't a factory imperfection or the result of a worn-out weapon. It was deliberate, a modification, a signature, left by a gunsmith or a killer who understood firearms intimately. This wasn't just a casing. It was a clue meticulously crafted, then carelessly lost. He stood, the plastic baggie held tight in his fist, his gaze sweeping the skeletal remains of the auto shop. He could feel the shape of the old crime forming around him, the violent heist on I-77 that had become a piece of Cleveland lore. 3 guards beaten, a fortune vanished, and a case file thick with dead ends and exhausted leads. It had been chalked up to professional out-of-towners who were too smart, too fast, and too lucky. But this casing suggested a different story. It wasn't found on the rain-soaked road surface where the robbery occurred. It was here, miles away, hidden beneath the floor of a building that had been vacant since 1990. A place to lie low, to divide the score, a place to make a mistake. The initial report mentioned no shots were fired during the robbery itself. The guards were brutalized, not shot. Kowalski's mind raced through the possibilities, his internal triggers firing with a mix of excitement and dread. A warning shot fired in celebration, an accidental discharge during the transfer of money, or something far more sinister that never made it into the official record. This single piece of brass didn't just reopen a case, it challenged the entire narrative that had settled over the city like dust. For 38 years, the truth of the Brinks heist had been a ghost. Now Kowalski held a tangible piece of it, its microscopic imperfections, promising to unravel a story of violence and betrayal that had been hidden for longer than he'd been a cop. He turned to his junior detective, his voice low and steady, masking the storm of theories already gathering in his mind. "Get this to the lab. I want every millimeter of it scanned, analyzed, and cross-referenced. Run the composition, check the head stamp. Everything." He didn't need to say more. The hunt had begun. The image on the comparison microscope's monitor filled the screen, a split view showing the firing pin impression from the recovered casing alongside a standard 9mm strike. The difference was stark, undeniable. On the right, a perfect circle from a factory standard pin. On the left, the aberrant crater from the auto shop floor, with its telltale scratch looking like a deliberate flaw, a microscopic scar. Detective Kowalski leaned closer, his reflection a faint ghost on the glowing display of the ballistics lab's primary analysis station. "He filed it down," Kowalski murmured, more to himself than to the lab technician beside him. "Took a tool to his own firing pin, not just to be unique, but to be untraceable. A standard weapon could be matched to a casing, but a modified one, if the weapon itself was never found, created a dead end." It was the work of someone who knew exactly how forensic science worked, or rather, how it worked in 1987. The national database whirred and clicked, its algorithms searching through millions of digital files for a match. The result came back as he expected, a flat, definitive negative. No known firearm in any system, past or present, bore that specific signature. It was a ghost gun before ghost guns were a common term, its identity erased not by the absence of a serial number on its frame, but by the deliberate mutilation of its most critical component. Frustration was a familiar, bitter taste in Kowalski's mouth, but it was quickly replaced by a new line of inquiry. The firing pin was a dead end, but the casing itself might still have a story to tell. "Run the metallurgical report again," he ordered the technician. "Forget the markings. What is it made of? Pinpoint the brass and copper ratios. Trace the manufacturer." An hour later, the answer materialized in a string of text on the screen. The alloy composition was specific, a proprietary blend used almost exclusively by Olin Corporation for a single massive government contract in the mid-1980s. It was military-grade ammunition, produced for a short period and sold under strict controls. It wasn't the kind of ammo a common stick-up artist would buy at a gun show. This detail narrowed the field from millions of possibilities to a handful of restricted supply chains. Kowalski felt that familiar thrum again, the feeling of a cold trail suddenly warming beneath his feet. He instructed the lab to magnify the casing's base, the small, flat area around the primer known as the head stamp, buried under layers of grime and microscopic corrosion, was something the initial field analysis had missed. Faintly etched into the brass, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a tiny sequence of numbers and letters, far smaller than the manufacturer's mark. It wasn't a standard production code, it looked like an inventory stamp, something added after manufacturing. Kowalski held his breath, a knot of anticipation tightening in his gut. This was it. This was the mistake. The gunman was meticulous enough to modify his weapon, but arrogant enough to use ammunition that could be traced. He spent the next 2 days calling in favors, pulling on strings that led deep into the dusty archives of federal procurement records. The inventory number was an enigma at first, not matching any military logs. Then, on a hunch, Kowalski expanded his search to include law enforcement distribution. He hit a match. The serial number belonged to a crate of 1,000 rounds of experimental ammunition shipped from a U.S. Army depot to a single destination in July of 1987. The recipient was the Cleveland Police Department, specifically for field testing by its SWAT and tactical units. The delivery had been signed for and locked away in the department's central armory just 3 weeks before the Brinks heist on Interstate 77. The sterile air of the lab suddenly felt suffocating. The implications of the discovery landed on Kowalski with physical weight, settling a cold dread in his stomach. The meticulously planned smash and grab wasn't the work of skilled out-of-town professionals. It wasn't a random act of violent opportunism. The bullet casing wasn't just a clue, it was an indictment. The robbery had been an inside job, but not just a Brinks insider. The unique tool marks on the casing, combined with the origin of the ammunition, pointed to a place Kowalski had never thought to look: his own department. Someone with access to the CPD armory, someone with tactical training, someone who knew the law enforcement response time from the inside. This changed everything. The case wasn't just cold, it had been buried, likely by someone wearing a badge. The dead ends in the original investigation suddenly looked less like failures and more like deliberate misdirection. He was no longer just a detective solving a robbery. He was investigating a conspiracy that had its roots inside the very institution he had sworn to uphold. The single bullet casing had cracked open the case, but it had also cracked the foundation of his own world, exposing a betrayal that had been festering for 38 years. He stared at the screen, at the damning evidence, and a single chilling question formed in his mind: who was the cop? The nursing home smelled of disinfectant and steamed vegetables, a scent that tried and failed to mask the underlying notes of age and quiet desperation. Detective Kowalski found Eddie Vasquez in a small room overlooking a manicured lawn he would never walk on again. A wheelchair was his permanent station, his body a frail vessel for a mind still sharp but trapped by the tremors of Parkinson's, a cruel parting gift from the steel pipe that had fractured his skull 38 years ago. Eddie's hands shook as he took the cup of water Kowalski offered, the plastic rattling against his teeth. But when Kowalski slid the evidence bag containing the bullet casing onto the small table beside him, the tremors seemed to lessen. The old man's gaze, previously clouded with a gentle sort of distance, sharpened into a focused point, a flicker of the guard he once was igniting in his faded blue eyes. Recognition wasn't immediate, but it was definite. He stared at the tarnished brass for a long time, the silence in the room broken only by the hum of an air purifier and the faint ticking of a clock. It wasn't the casing itself he recognized, but the idea of it, the ghost it represented. A memory surfaced, fighting its way through the fog of decades and medication. "They said no shots were fired," Eddie whispered, his voice a dry rasp, each word an effort. "The reports, the papers, they all said they just beat us. But there was a shot. One shot." Kowalski leaned forward, keeping his own voice soft, coaxing the memory out. "Where, Eddie? Where was the shot fired?" He saw the internal struggle in the man's face, the fear of dredging up a trauma he had tried to bury for most of his life. "Not on the highway," Eddie said, his eyes unfocusing as he looked past Kowalski, back to that rain-lashed stretch of road. "After, it was at the place they took us. A garage, an old workshop. It was dark, smelled of grease." His description matched the abandoned auto shop perfectly. The story tumbled out in broken fragments, a narrative suppressed for nearly 4 decades. The masked men hadn't just dumped the guards and fled, they had taken them, bound and hooded, to a secondary location to ensure they couldn't immediately identify the getaway vehicle or direction of travel. "There were 3 of them with masks," Eddie continued, his breathing becoming shallow. "But there was a 4th man. He was in the truck with us. This was it." Kowalski felt a cold thrill, the confirmation of a suspicion that had been growing since he first saw the casing. "He wasn't one of the robbers?" Kowalski asked, his pen hovering over his notepad. "He was one of you? A Brinks employee?" Eddie shook his head, a single tear tracing a path through the wrinkles on his cheek. "No." He was familiar, knew the route codes, knew the silent alarm protocol. "He's the one who let them know when we were clear of the city traffic, when we were most vulnerable." The ultimate betrayal wasn't just from a cop, but from someone they trusted in that very truck. The old guard's story veered sharply from the official record. The official report, signed by the lead detectives in 1987, stated 3 guards were found at the scene on the highway. There was no mention of an abduction, a secondary location, or a 4th man. "What happened to him, Eddie?" "The 4th man?" Kowalski pressed gently. "That's where the shot came from." Eddie's voice cracked, the memory now vivid, visceral. "He argued with one of them, the leader, I think, about the money, the plan." It got loud. Then, the pop. It was loud in that small space. The sound had been muffled by the garage walls, an explosion of violence no one outside would have heard. He explained that after the gunshot, the remaining men panicked. They bound Eddie and the other two guards, dumped them back in their own van, and abandoned it a few miles from the original crash site, creating a confusing trail for investigators. But the fourth man was never seen again. We told the first cops on the scene. Eddie insisted, his shaking hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. We told them everything. About the fourth man, the garage, the gunshot. They took our statements. His eyes locked with Kowalski's, pleading for belief. Then the lead detective came, a lieutenant. He told us we were confused, traumatized, said our stories didn't match. The cover-up wasn't just a possibility, it was a certainty. The original investigators had deliberately excised the most crucial parts of the witnesses' testimony. They had erased the fourth man, the abduction, and the gunshot from the official narrative, burying the only lead that could have solved the case from day one. He told us to stick to the story. The smash and grab on the highway, said it would make for a cleaner case, easier to catch them. Eddie's voice dropped to a near inaudible whisper, heavy with the weight of decades of silent fear. But we knew he was burying it. Protecting someone. The lieutenant hadn't been simplifying the investigation. He had been suffocating it. The bullet casing wasn't just evidence of a murder, it was proof of a police conspiracy, orchestrated by an officer who had convinced 3 traumatized men that their own memories were lies. The city's digital archives were a labyrinth of poorly scanned documents and corrupted files, a digital graveyard where old cases went to be forgotten. Kowalski spent 2 nights fueled by black coffee and a gnawing suspicion running searches for any anomalies related to the 1987 Brinks investigation. He wasn't just looking for clues about the robbery anymore, he was hunting for the ghost in his own department. He cross-referenced the duty rosters from the day of the heist with the names of every officer who had touched the original case file. Hours blurred into a monotonous cycle of clicking and reading, his eyes burning from the screen's steady glow. Then, he found it, not in the main case file, which was pristine and straightforward, but in a tangentially related internal affairs folder, mislabeled and buried 3 layers deep in the server directory. The file documented a preliminary inquiry into Officer Marcus Webb, a 5-year veteran of the force. According to the daily logs, Webb had been suspiciously absent from his assigned patrol route for a 3-hour window on the afternoon of the robbery. His radio had been silent, and he had failed to check in, an infraction that should have triggered an immediate and severe response. Instead, the incident had been quietly handled by his supervising lieutenant. The IA report was thin, almost purposefully vague, noting that Webb had claimed a radio malfunction and a personal emergency. The inquiry was closed a week later with a simple reprimand, an impossibly light punishment for such a serious breach of protocol during a major citywide crime. Kowalski's blood ran cold. He pulled up Marcus Webb's personnel file. Webb was a decorated officer with commendations for marksmanship and tactical proficiency. He had been a rising star, yet 6 months after the Brinks heist, he was quietly dismissed from the Cleveland Police Department. The official reason cited was administrative reasons, a catch-all phrase used to sweep scandals under the rug. There was no disciplinary hearing, no public record of misconduct. One day Marcus Webb was a cop, and the next, he was gone. Kowalski scrolled down to the equipment checkout log, his heart pounding a heavy rhythmic beat against his ribs. Every officer was required to return their service weapon upon termination. Webb's file showed his badge, uniform, and patrol car keys had all been accounted for. But there was one line item left conspicuously blank. Service weapon Smith & Wesson Model 5906, serial number TFF 3487. The firearm had never been returned to the armory. It was a loose end so massive it could only have been ignored on purpose. A missing police service weapon was a cardinal sin, an administrative failure that would have triggered alarms all the way to the chief's office. But it hadn't. Just like Webb's convenient absence on the day of the heist, it had been quietly absorbed by the system, erased by a commanding officer willing to look the other way. Kowalski's hands trembled slightly as he typed the weapon's serial number into a new search query, linking it to the ballistics database. He didn't need the system to confirm what he already knew, but he needed to see it to make it real. He ran a speculative analysis, asking the system to model what a casing fired from that specific model would look like if its firing pin had been manually filed down in the exact pattern he'd seen under the microscope. The result flashed on the screen a moment later. A perfect match. The distinctive, scarred impression from the casing found in the auto shop aligned flawlessly with the dimensions and unique properties of a modified Smith & Wesson 5906, the same model issued to Marcus Webb. The ghost had a name. It wasn't just a corrupt cop, it was the inside man, the tactician, and the gunman. Webb had used his knowledge of police procedure to vanish from his beat, participated in the robbery, and then murdered his accomplice at the garage. The single gunshot Eddie Vasquez had heard was Webb eliminating the fourth man, the Brinks insider, to silence a potential witness and secure a larger share of the money. A wave of nausea washed over Kowalski. The trust he had placed in the badge, in the blue line, shattered into a million pieces. The cover-up wasn't just to protect a fellow officer, it was to hide a murder committed by one of their own. The lead detective on the original case hadn't just buried a lead, he had buried a homicide, allowing a killer cop to walk away clean. Kowalski pushed back from his desk, the glow of the monitor illuminating the grim set of his jaw. He now had the gunman and the weapon. But Marcus Webb had vanished 38 years ago, likely with $800,000 in cash. Finding him was the next step, but Kowalski knew the conspiracy didn't end with a single rogue officer. Someone powerful had helped him disappear. The file on his screen was not the end of the investigation, it was the beginning of a hunt for a web of corruption that had poisoned the department for decades. Marcus Webb was a ghost. Public records showed he had moved to Florida in 1990, then fell off the grid entirely, no credit history, no property records, no digital footprint. Kowalski assumed he was either dead or living under a new identity, a dead end that left the stolen $800,000 as the only remaining trail. He turned his attention to the one person Webb couldn't have completely erased from his life, his ex-wife Sarah. Their divorce was finalized a year after his dismissal from the force. She had never remarried, and she still lived in a modest house in a quiet Cleveland suburb, working as a pharmacy technician. On paper, she was unremarkable. A woman left behind by a disgraced cop. Kowalski began a quiet surveillance, expecting to find nothing. For 2 weeks, Sarah's routine was painfully normal: work, grocery store, home. But then he noticed a deviation. On the first of the month, every month she drove 20 miles out of the city to a remote, windswept storage facility called Guardian Self-Storage. He set up in a nondescript van across the street, the long lens of his camera focused on the row of faded blue doors. Just after noon, Sarah's sedan pulled up to Unit 47. She glanced around, her movements casual, but her eyes constantly scanning the perimeter, a subtle paranoia that Kowalski recognized instantly. She unlocked the heavy steel door and disappeared inside. Through his telephoto lens, Kowalski watched a scene that turned his investigation on its head. Inside the dusty, cobweb-filled unit, among a few boxes of old clothes and forgotten furniture, was a large, military-style footlocker. Sarah opened it with a key from her purse. The footlocker was filled with bundles of cash, each wrapped tightly in clear plastic and secured with yellowed rubber bands. The bills were old, the design consistent with currency from the 1980s. Kowalski zoomed in, his camera capturing the weathered texture of the plastic and the brittle appearance of the rubber. This wasn't recent criminal activity, this was the hoard. It was the $800,000 from the Brinks truck, preserved like a grotesque time capsule. He watched her, mesmerized. Her actions weren't emotional or nostalgic, there was no moment of quiet reflection for a lost husband. It was pure business. She pulled out several bundles, her fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of a bank teller. She unwrapped one, counted out a stack of bills, and placed it in her purse. She then rewrapped the remaining money, checked the desiccant packs meant to prevent mold, and locked the footlocker. Her movements were a well-oiled routine, a monthly ritual of financial management. This wasn't a grieving widow clinging to a dark secret. This was an active participant. A sudden cold realization settled over Kowalski. The money had never been recovered because it had never been spent in a way that would attract attention. It hadn't been laundered through offshore accounts or flashy purchases. It was being bled slowly, systematically, a few $1,000s at a time, for 38 years. Sarah wasn't just Webb's ex-wife, she was his banker, the steward of his blood money. Her modest life, her quiet job, it was all a facade, a carefully constructed cover for a decades-long crime. The reason Webb could disappear so completely was that he never needed to access the money himself. Sarah was his lifeline, his connection to the wealth he had stolen. Kowalski recorded every moment, the camera's quiet clicks documenting the undeniable proof. The woman who had presented herself as a victim was in fact a central figure in the conspiracy. She had been living off the proceeds of the robbery her entire adult life, a silent partner in a crime that had left one man dead and 3 others traumatized. He watched her lock the unit, her face a mask of calm composure as she drove away. The entire narrative of the case had shifted once again. It was no longer a cold case about a rogue cop who vanished. It was an active criminal enterprise, operated by a woman hiding in plain sight. Kowalski lowered his camera, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. The case was no longer just about the past. The money was still in play, which meant the conspiracy was still alive. He had found the stolen fortune, but in doing so, he had uncovered a betrayal that was colder and more calculating than he could have ever imagined. His next target was clear. He wouldn't just be investigating Sarah, he would be dismantling her entire life, piece by piece, until he found where the money was going. Kowalski's surveillance of Sarah Webb led him to the place she spent 40 hours a week, the Cleveland Family Pharmacy. It was a small, independent drugstore in a working-class neighborhood, the kind of place where the pharmacist knew customers by name. From the outside, it was a picture of community service. But as Kowalski dug deeper, he realized it was the engine of a far more sinister operation. He placed a discreet pinhole camera in the ceiling of a convenience store across the street, its lens aimed directly at the pharmacy's back entrance and employee parking lot. He synced the footage with a review of the pharmacy's financial records, which he had obtained through a hard-won subpoena. The numbers told a story that the quiet storefront tried to hide. For years, the pharmacy had been reporting unusually high cash deposits, far exceeding what a business of its size should generate. The deposits were always in small, irregular amounts, consistently just under the $10,000 threshold that would trigger a mandatory report to the IRS. It was classic money laundering, structured to look like daily cash flow. Over 38 years, the total of these suspicious deposits was just over $800,000. The connection was undeniable, but Kowalski needed to see the mechanism. He watched the surveillance footage for days, logging every movement. He saw Sarah arrive, leave, and interact with customers. Then he noticed the pattern. Late at night, long after closing, a man would stay behind. His name was Dr. James Morrison, the owner and head pharmacist. He was also Sarah Webb's husband of the last 20 years. The third major twist landed like a physical blow. Sarah hadn't just been the steward of Webb's stolen money, she had married the man who could help her wash it. Under the cover of darkness, Morrison's pharmacy transformed. Kowalski's surveillance camera captured a steady stream of late-night visitors, addicts desperate and shaking, who slipped cash to Morrison through the back door in exchange for Ziploc bags filled with prescription pills. Morrison wasn't just selling a few extra painkillers under the table, he was running a full-scale pill mill. He took the dirty, decades-old cash from the Brinks heist, swapped it for the clean cash from his illegal drug sales, and then deposited the drug money into the pharmacy's bank account. He was converting the proceeds of a violent robbery into the profits of a business that preyed on the city's most vulnerable. The $800,000 from the 1987 heist hadn't just been laundered, it had been weaponized. The crime hadn't ended with the robbery, it had metastasized, evolving from a single act of theft into a criminal enterprise that had fueled the city's opioid crisis for 2 decades. Each dollar washed through the pharmacy's books represented a life destroyed by addiction, a family torn apart. Kowalski felt a surge of cold fury. This was bigger than a cold case. The trauma of the robbery hadn't been confined to the 3 guards left beaten on the highway concrete. It had spread like a cancer, its poison seeping into the very fabric of the community. Marcus Webb's greed had created a legacy of pain that continued to unfold every single day in the back alley behind Morrison's pharmacy. He now understood the full picture. Webb planned the heist and committed the murder. Sarah guarded the money and managed the slow, careful distribution. And Morrison, her new husband, built the machine that made it all disappear, creating a new wave of victims in the process. They were a triumvirate of crime, their partnership a twisted mockery of a family business. The evidence was all there. The financial records showing the exact amount of stolen cash, the surveillance footage of the drug deals, the clear connection between Sarah and Morrison. Kowalski had followed the money, and it had led him to an abyss of moral corruption far deeper than he had anticipated. His focus shifted from solving a robbery to dismantling an empire. He wasn't just chasing the ghost of Marcus Webb anymore, he was going after the king and queen who had built their throne on his stolen fortune and the wreckage of countless lives. To bring down the empire, Kowalski had to get inside. Posing as a low-level dealer looking for a new supplier, he used a confidential informant to arrange a meeting with one of Dr. Morrison's backdoor distributors. Kowalski, now Ray, wore frayed jeans and a worn jacket, his usual sharp, analytical gaze replaced with the haunted, twitchy energy of a man desperate for a score. A wire was taped to his chest, its microphone smaller than a dime. The meeting took place in a dimly lit bar that smelled of stale beer and regret. Morrison's man, a nervous, sweaty individual named Kevin, explained the system. "It's not about big moves," Kevin said, his eyes darting around the room. "Jimmy, Dr. Morrison is smart. He keeps it small. Multiple pharmacies, not just the one." The wire captured every word, every damning detail. Morrison and Sarah hadn't just been laundering the money through their single pharmacy, they had acquired 4 other small, struggling drugstores across Ohio, using the clean, laundered cash to buy them out. Each pharmacy became a new node in their network, a new spigot for illegal prescriptions and a new drain for the remaining Brinks money. Each location processed only a small fraction of the cash, making the individual operations nearly impossible to flag. It was a brilliant, decentralized system that had allowed them to operate undetected for years. The robbery money funded the expansion, and the expansion accelerated the laundering, a self-sustaining cycle of criminality. Every transaction recorded on the wire provided more evidence of how the single heist had metastasized into a sophisticated criminal syndicate. Kowalski's feigned desperation and knowledge of street-level trade were convincing. Kevin agreed to introduce him to Morrison directly, believing Ray could help them move a larger volume of oxycodone to a new market. Kowalski's internal trigger, a cold, focused rage, was masked by a convincing performance of greed and ambition. He was determined to get the entire conspiracy on tape, from the street-level dealers to the king himself. The meeting with Dr. Morrison took place in the back office of the Cleveland Family Pharmacy. The air was sterile, a sharp contrast to the dirty business being discussed. Morrison was calm, professional, a man who looked more like a friendly neighborhood pharmacist than a drug lord. He spoke in quiet, measured tones, explaining the logistics of his operation with the detached air of a CEO discussing supply chains. "We don't deal with amateurs, Ray," Morrison said, his gaze analytical. "My wife handles the finances. She's very particular. Every dollar must be accounted for." He mentioned Sarah by name, directly linking her to the criminal conspiracy on a federal wire. It was the confirmation Kowalski needed. Kowalski pushed his luck, asking about the source of their initial investment capital. "You guys started this empire from scratch?" he asked, framing it as a question of admiration. "That takes serious seed money." Morrison smiled, a thin, self-satisfied expression. "Let's just say my wife came into an inheritance a long time ago," he said smoothly. "Her first husband left her with a significant nest egg. We've been managing it ever since." The casual, dismissive way he spoke about Marcus Webb's blood money sent a chill down Kowalski's spine. The conversation provided a complete blueprint of their operation, the network of pharmacies, Sarah's role as the financier, and Morrison's as the operational chief. They had turned $800,000 from a violent robbery into a multi-million-dollar illegal enterprise that stretched across the state. The wire on Kowalski's chest captured it all, every word a nail in their coffins. As he left the pharmacy, the promise of a future deal secured, Kowalski felt the full weight of the case. It had started with a single bullet casing on a dirty concrete floor. Now it encompassed a vast network responsible for flooding communities with poison, all built on a foundation of lies and violence that was nearly 4 decades old. His determination hardened into a cold, sharp point. He had the dealers and the launderers. Now he just needed to find the final piece, the person inside Brinks who had made it all possible in the first place. With the wiretap evidence against Morrison and Sarah secured, Kowalski obtained a warrant to search their home and the pharmacy's back office. He led the raid himself, a small, trusted team moving in at 3 in the morning. The house was a monument to suburban normalcy, but Kowalski knew the truth was hidden beneath the placid surface. In Morrison's home office, behind a false back panel in a heavy oak bookcase, they found a locked safe. A technician cracked it open in minutes. Inside, beneath stacks of pristine laundered cash and ledgers detailing the pharmacy network's profits, was a worn manila folder yellowed with age. Kowalski lifted it out, his gloves preserving any prints. The label on the tab, written in faint, faded ink, simply read, "Contingency." Inside the folder were original Brinks route schedules and transfer manifests from the summer of 1987. They were detailed printouts, showing truck numbers, guard assignments, and precise timings for every high-value transport in the Cleveland area. It was the playbook for the robbery, a treasure map leading to the $800,000. Kowalski's eyes scanned the pages, his mind racing. This was definitive proof of an inside source at the armored car company. The schedules were covered in handwritten notes, tactical observations about weak points in the routes and shift change timings. He recognized the blocky, aggressive handwriting immediately from the personnel file he had studied for hours. It was Marcus Webb's. Webb had clearly used this information to plan the heist down to the second, but as Kowalski turned to the final page, a single sheet summarizing the most vulnerable route, he saw something that made him pause. At the bottom of the page, beneath Webb's scrawled calculations, was a signature of authorization. The schedule had been officially signed out of the Brinks transport office by a supervisor. The signature was a clean, elegant script, Helen Torres, transport supervisor. Kowalski felt a jolt, a sudden, sickening sense of vertigo. He knew that name. He'd seen it on the original witness list from 1987. Helen Torres was one of the dispatchers who had been on duty that day, her testimony a minor, procedural part of the initial investigation. She had expressed shock and grief, offering support to the families of the beaten guards. A quick search on the Brinks employee database revealed the most shocking detail of all. Helen Torres, now in her late 60s, was still an employee. After 4 decades of loyal service, she had risen through the ranks and was now the head of regional security for the entire Midwest Division. She had been hiding in plain sight, a wolf guarding the henhouse. The betrayal was staggering in its scope. Helen Torres wasn't just a source. She was the source. She had handed Marcus Webb the keys to the kingdom, providing the critical intelligence that made the robbery possible. Then she had spent the next 38 years building a career within the very company she had betrayed, her success a monument to her deception. Kowalski stood in Morrison's office, the folder in his hand, feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. He imagined Helen Torres at company memorials, offering condolences to Eddie Vasquez and the other guards, her face a mask of sympathy. She had watched them live with the physical and psychological scars of an attack she had helped orchestrate. The sheer coldness of it was almost incomprehensible. The web was now almost complete. Webb, the gunman; Sarah, the banker; Morrison, the launder; and Helen, the originator, the inside source who started it all. She was the first domino. He wondered what her motivation was. Greed? Coercion? Was she a willing partner or another victim of Webb's manipulation? He had to find out. The folder also contained a clue to that question. Tucked into a side pocket was a faded photograph of a younger Helen standing beside a man at a family picnic. On the back, an inscription: Helen and Frank, Summer '86. Kowalski didn't recognize the man, but the name Frank sparked a flicker of familiarity he couldn't quite place. He snapped a photo of the picture with his phone, a feeling of unease telling him this last piece of the puzzle was more critical and more dangerous than any of the others. The conspiracy was deeper than he knew. Kowalski found the address on a slip of paper tucked into the contingency folder, a location scribbled in Webb's handwriting, a derelict warehouse in the industrial flats by the Cuyahoga River. The note beside it read, "Divide Point." This was where the money had been taken after the robbery, where the fourth man was shot, where the conspiracy was sealed in blood. The building was still standing, a skeleton of rust and broken windows scheduled for demolition. He didn't go in with a SWAT team. He went alone, asking Helen Torres to meet him there under the guise of an urgent security consultation about the old Brinks case. She arrived, looking composed, her expensive suit and confident stride a testament to the successful career she had built on a foundation of lies. Her expression shifted from curiosity to alarm as she realized the warehouse was abandoned. "What is this, detective?" she asked, her voice sharp, the first crack in her polished facade. "This place was decommissioned decades ago." "I know," Kowalski said, his voice flat and cold. He held up a copy of the route schedule she had signed in 1987. "You were here then too, weren't you, Helen? This is where you met Webb after the heist." Panic flashed in her eyes, a raw, primal fear that erased 38 years of composure. The mask shattered completely. Her body tensed, her gaze darting toward the exits, as if she could still run from a crime that had finally caught up to her. She began to deny it, the words catching in her throat, but the evidence was irrefutable. "Webb's dead," she finally stammered, shifting her strategy from denial to deflection. "He died years ago. You can't prove anything." "I don't need to," Kowalski replied, his tone relentless. "I have his wife, her new husband, and a pharmacy network they use to launder every last dollar. I have the bullet casing from the man Webb shot right here in this building. The only thing I don't have is why a trusted supervisor would sell out her own men." Tears welled in Helen's eyes, but Kowalski knew they were tears of self-pity, not remorse. "He made me," she claimed, her voice breaking. "Webb was smart, charming, but he was a monster. He found out about my brother, about his gambling debts. He threatened to expose him, to ruin his career, his family." She painted a picture of herself as a victim, a woman forced into an impossible choice. She provided Webb with the route information, believing it would be a simple robbery with no violence. She claimed she had no idea he planned to use such brutality, let alone commit murder. "Who was the fourth man, Helen?" Kowalski pressed, unmoved by her performance. "The one Webb killed here, the Brinks insider on the truck." She hesitated, shaking her head. "I don't know his name, just that Webb had someone on the inside to disable the secondary tracking unit." It was a plausible story, a desperate attempt to minimize her role. But Kowalski remembered the photograph from the safe, the picture of Helen and a man named Frank. He remembered where he'd seen that name before, on the original 1987 case file. The lead detective, the lieutenant who had taken the guard's statements and then buried their testimony, the man who had personally signed off on the official report that erased the fourth man and the gunshot. "Your brother, Helen," Kowalski said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "His name is Frank, isn't it? Detective Lieutenant Frank Torres." The fourth and most devastating twist landed in the cavernous silence of the warehouse. Helen froze, her face draining of all color. The lie she had maintained for nearly 4 decades collapsed under the weight of a single name. The third conspirator, the missing piece of the puzzle, wasn't some unknown lowlife. It was her own brother, a high-ranking police official who had used his badge not just to protect her, but to orchestrate the cover-up from the inside. Frank Torres hadn't just buried evidence to protect his sister from a coercive criminal. He had been an active partner. His gambling debts were the motive. Helen provided the access, Webb provided the muscle, and Frank provided the immunity. He had deliberately steered the investigation into a dead end, ensuring that Webb, his sister, and the money would all disappear without a trace. The corruption didn't just touch the police force, it came from the very top of the investigation. Kowalski finally understood. This was never just a robbery, it was a conspiracy between a cop, a supervisor, and a detective lieutenant, a perfect triangle of crime and corruption. Helen's confession, now stripped of all its self-serving lies, revealed a betrayal so profound it defied belief. She hadn't been protecting her brother from Webb, she had been conspiring with him all along. The trap was set. Federal agents, clad in tactical gear, formed a silent perimeter around the Cleveland family pharmacy, their movements fluid and precise in the pre-dawn gloom. Inside, Dr. Morrison was counting the previous day's cash, oblivious to the net closing around him. But Kowalski's primary target wasn't the pharmacy, it was the final, desperate phone call he knew was coming. His real victory had come 12 hours earlier, in a sterile interrogation room. Faced with his sister's full confession and the mountain of evidence connecting him to the cover-up, Lieutenant Frank Torres had crumbled. His career, his reputation, his freedom, all gone. With the promise of a deal from the U.S. Attorney's Office, he had agreed to cooperate, his betrayal of his fellow conspirators the final act in a life defined by them. Kowalski sat in a surveillance van a block away from the pharmacy, a headset pressed to his ear. He listened to the open line on Frank Torres's personal cell phone, which now rested on the table in front of the disgraced lieutenant. As the first federal agent breached the pharmacy door, shouting, "FBI, hands in the air," Kowalski knew Sarah Webb Morrison's world was imploding. Her first instinct was not to surrender, but to call her protector. The call came through 30 seconds later. "Frank? Frank, they're here? The feds are all over the pharmacy." Sarah's voice was a high-pitched shriek of terror and disbelief. "You have to do something. Call it off. You're a lieutenant, for God's sake." On the other end of the line, Frank Torres read from a script Kowalski had prepared. "I can't, Sarah. It's over." His voice was hollow, defeated. The recorded conversation was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. "What do you mean you can't?" She screamed into the phone, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic torrent. "Our deal. For 40 years, I kept the money, we washed it, and you kept us safe. You have to get us out of this, or I swear to God, I will tell them everything. I'll tell them about you, about Helen, about the whole damn thing." It was a full confession, delivered in a moment of pure panic, broadcast directly into the FBI's evidence locker. Kowalski listened as Sarah, realizing Frank would not save her, threatened to burn their entire world to the ground, unaware that it was already a smoldering ruin. Her admission of decades of money laundering, her explicit acknowledgement of the conspiracy with Frank and Helen, it was all captured in crystal-clear audio. Kowalski gave the signal. He watched on a monitor as agents swarmed into the pharmacy's back office, pulling a stunned Dr. Morrison from his chair. Simultaneously, another team entered Sarah's home, taking her into custody mid-phone call, and across town, 2 uniformed officers formally arrested Lieutenant Frank Torres, the man who had just sealed his own fate. 3 generations of criminals, all interconnected, apprehended in the same moment. Through the bulletproof glass of the van, Kowalski watched the city he served begin to wake up, its inhabitants unaware that a wound nearly 4 decades old had finally been cleansed. His gaze fell upon the evidence bag on the seat beside him, the one containing the single, tarnished bullet casing that started it all. It looked so small, so insignificant, yet it had possessed enough gravity to pull down an entire criminal empire. He thought of Eddie Vasquez in his wheelchair, of the lives destroyed by Morrison's pills, of the broken trust within his own department. The arrests were a victory, but they felt hollow. He was forced to confront the chilling reality of how one moment of violent greed on a rain-slicked stretch of highway had branched out like a poison root, corrupting everything it touched for 38 years, a silent plague hidden beneath the surface of the city. The case was closed, but the scars, he knew, would remain.